The second element, a renewed focus on poverty, a return to focusing on poverty. The third, which is linked to the Millennium Development Goals, comes out of a series of conferences on aid effectiveness, a series of high-level forums on aid effectiveness. And these forums have emphasized country ownership of aid programming. So this is from the 2005 Paris High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness, this triangle that says foreign aid programs need to be country-owned, that the partners, meaning the countries that are receiving the aid, they should be setting the agenda. Donors should be aligning behind this country-owned agenda, which in part means using systems within those countries. And then donors should be harmonizing, meaning that they should be coordinating their programming so that together they're using the systems in the aid-receiving countries and that they are adhering together to the agenda that has been set by those aid-receiving countries. And then all together this should lead to some results and should lead to mutual accountability. There's been real lip service paid to this notion of country ownership, to this idea of aligning and using the government systems that exist in poor countries, and then to this notion of harmonizing. There's been real lip service. There's not been so much behavioral change. So the OECD has conducted some monitoring surveys on this. The Paris Declaration set a bunch of goals. Of the 13 goals that were in the 2005 Paris Declaration, as of 2010, only one of those 13 had been met. I don't have all 13 up there. So donors are not reporting their aid flows in such a way that government budgets take account of them. They're not using public financial management systems in poor countries. They've not reduced the number of parallel implementation units, that is, donor-supported entities that are running projects as compared to government entities that are running projects. They've not made aid disbursement more predictable. They've not untied aid. They've not switched to general budget support. They're still funding projects. And then they're not doing their missions together, that donors are still sending separate missions. There's some crazy statistic about Tanzania, how the Minister of Finance has to meet with 1,000 different foreign aid missions per year because each donor sends a different mission. So if the third element of the post-Washington consensus is that there should be country ownership of aid, we're seeing a lot of talk about that, but not evidence that it's actually happening on the ground. And I could talk a bit more about that vis-a-vis one specific initiative, if you wanted, during Q&A. So Danny Roderick has an article titled, Goodbye Washington Consensus, Hello Washington Confusion, wondering where we are in the development discourse and development agenda today. So one thing that's pretty universally agreed on is that whereas during the structural adjustment era there was a lot of faith that implementing those structural adjustment reforms would lead to economic growth, today there's a lot of faith that we don't know how to bring about economic growth. That there's no cookie-cutter set of reforms that's going to work in every country. And so Roderick says this. The Barcelona Development Agenda likewise said there's no single set of policies that's going to be guaranteed to bring about economic growth. We see that there's widespread agreement that institutions matter, but we see less agreement about how exactly to create those institutions, how to improve institutions, or even to really know which institutions matter. The way that institutions are measured ends up being pretty subjective, pretty broad. So what should countries really be focusing their energies on? We're a lot less sure. We've seen this renewed focus on anti-poverty programming, and with that we've seen some innovations in programming, not just the community-driven development projects that I mentioned, but also conditional cash transfer programs, which have become very popular in the developing world, and particularly Latin America. We've seen some innovations in aid delivery. The World Bank just last month announced this new P4R, Partnership for Results aid, in which countries are only going to get the foreign aid after they show results. Here's a contract. We're going to give you money when you show that school enrollments have increased, when you show that immunization rates have increased. That's an innovation. But overall, I think that the evidence remains that the best way to lift people out of poverty is through achieving economic growth, through achieving large-scale economic growth. And then we have this new emphasis on country ownership and better patterns of aid giving, but the donor behavior really has yet to live up to the commitments that they've made, the commitments that they've signed on to with the Paris Declaration 7 years ago. And there remain some serious challenges to implementing that Paris agenda. So, some pessimistic caveats to each of these 3 bullet points that are the post-Washington consensus. Yet, to end on a more hopeful note, I hope that these 3 things allow for more innovation and less rigidity within the development industry, within the development world. And then, if you don't like these conclusions, come back next week and Ashwini Chatra will tell you that the development industry doesn't matter at all, that it's really about remittances, migration, other flows to the developing world, that they're much more important than foreign aid, and in many ways he's quite right. But this is where the development industry is today. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. One thing that's strikingly absent from everything you've said, which I'm sure is accurate from start to finish, is any discussion of the environmental consequences of growth. Now, so one question I would have is that changing? That is to say, is current thinking about what should be aimed for incorporating awareness of the environmental consequences of growth? And then the other question I have that's linked to that is just if you think of, what we should all be thinking in terms of, and what we should all be thinking is a desirable goal that we should be trying to achieve, why would we think that poverty alleviation, if it comes at the expense of the local environment, is the thing to aim for? That is to say, shouldn't, just from the point of view of what we should be trying to achieve, that is what ideals we should be trying to strive for, shouldn't attention to the environmental consequences of growth actually be there combined in some complex way with poverty alleviation?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's an extremely important question, and I do think that the normative orientation of the question is quite correct as well. And I expected to get the question when I say that economic growth is what brings about poverty reduction, poverty alleviation, because economic growth, as the China example shows quite clearly, also can bring about things that border on or actually are environmental catastrophe, and that is a serious problem. So there is certainly a lot of activity within the development industry on the environment, attempts to integrate with other global conventions on the environment, attempts to provide aid that is environmentally friendly, and attempts to fund pro-environment projects. The evidence on the successfulness of any of that